So Commissioner, again, very welcome, and the floor is yours. I think we should give the Commissioner an applause to start with.
Thank you, Katharina. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, good morning. It's happy to see finally so many of you early in the morning, but I was told this is not unusual here in Stockholm to start so early in the morning. There are different so to say, behaviors across Europe, but finally, I'm very delighted to have this opportunity for a breakfast for budget. At least it's something, food and figures for thinking, hopefully, and finally. I could not imagine a menu which is more positive than the Swedish European one. This year we celebrate 25 years of being Sweden in the European Union, and I think we can agree that it has been a successful marriage, and different to others, there is no reason for any kind of divorce debate. This is already in days of like now, something quite good. And I think on a more serious note, while Europe benefits from Swedish innovation and solidarity, Sweden also benefits from the European Union, and I give you a few examples. For instance, Sweden has received 3.4 billion under the investment plan for Europe, the so-called Juncker plan, and this is set to trigger 13.4 billion in additional investments in projects which encourage innovation and jobs for the future. Few examples: the battery maker Northvolt, everybody of you, I assume, knows it, was supported by 350 million loan via this investment plan. While most of Sweden's EU funding, exactly 950 million euro, is for agriculture, the second largest share is already for growth and jobs, including research. This means European money fosters innovation, such as innovation cycling helmets. The Malmö-based company Höfting has developed an innovative cola containing a folded airbag. Some of my cabinet members already using it, so it has already arrived in Brussels. And this development was funded by 1.37 million euro from our research program Horizon 2020. And I was told that this helmet has already protected citizens in more than 1,300 accidents. The receipt for this successful marriage between the European Union and Sweden is anchored in the single market, which means for every krona Sweden invests in the European budget, you get more than 6 krona out of it, backed as single market benefits. The European single market offers Swedish companies a market of 500 million consumers without any borders. 60% of Swedish exports go to the other EU countries. So the single market is probably one, if not the biggest achievement of the European Union, and each European Union member state is benefiting from this opportunity, and the range is between 5 and 10 times more you receive from your quasi-investment into the single market. In the case of Sweden, it's actually more than 6 krona. I think it's 6.7 exactly. That means national contributions are by far smaller than the benefit the EU brings. This is why every euro invested in Europe pays off for citizens, companies, and regions. And I'm saying in particular regions in my former capacity 10 years ago as Commissioner for Regional Policy. Sweden and Europe have even more to gain. Together we can become the first climate-neutral continent. Greening the economy benefits not only the planet but also the citizens in their daily life, because we create jobs and opportunities for the future. Together we can become digital leaders by doing jointly funded research on artificial intelligence. Together, we can protect our borders so our citizens are better protected whatever global crisis might occur. And I have mentioned all these examples because it demonstrates that only, so to say, joint actions and initiatives are leading finally to results which benefits each individual citizen. And I like to quote in that context one of the founding members of the European Union, the then Belgian Foreign Minister Henri Spaak, who already 60 years ago said, each European country is a small one, but some of them don't know it yet. And I think this sentence 60 years ago, outspoken, is more than valid today, and this against the background of global competition, of global phenomena, which can only be addressed if we as Europeans stay together. And we should not forget, in 1900, 120 years ago, Europe still counted for 25% of global population. Today, it's only 6%, and our share is further declining. So the question is how to survive in this global environment. And I think it's obvious this is only possible if we stay together, if we act as a family, if we, so to say, offset different opportunities we are facing inside Europe, but finally it will strengthen all of us. And this is one of my biggest, if not to say the biggest message. I'm not here as a budget commissioner, as a beggar or as a demandeur. I'm simply trying to explain what is at stake, what is needed, what is possible, where we all share, I would say, the same view, but how can all this be achieved? And finally, to be honest, with a rather modest budget. And there are a few examples, and you know it very well. Climate policy is one of them. We have already, I referred already to it. And I mean, you have a young Swedish climate activist, Greta Thunberg. She's motivating people all over the world, but may I say, already Sweden in itself is a role model. With your very ambitious climate neutral welfare state target to be 2045 carbon neutral, you are part, I would say, of the European avant-garde in that respect. On a European level, we match this ambition with the Green Deal. Together, we will become the first climate neutral continent. It's the core, so to say, activity, the core goal of the new von der Leyen Commission, and it's something where we initiate something. We will not reap after 5 years already everything, but what we are doing is we initiate on a very bright basis everywhere in Europe actions, initiatives which finally lead and will make it possible to achieve this goal to be carbon neutral by 2050. But this is only achievable if we are working all together and if we help and assist each other. This means also to invest in new technologies, research, innovation, business development. The Green Deal can serve, and already we have proofs from the past, as a huge boost for economic development. Europe was always spearheading green technology activities in the past. In Sweden, but in other countries, hundreds of thousands of people are already working in the green technology business. So it's an opportunity. And I remember when I started 10 years ago as a commissioner for structural funds, we had at that time a cooperation with the Chinese. And once a year, there was a meeting between the respective Chinese minister and the Commissioner for Regional Policy. to agree about the topic of the next year, where in particular the Chinese usually came to Europe with the well-known small delegations, and were, so to say, figuring out what is possible or what is the state of play for their respective topic. And in 2010, our proposal was to address the climate situation of big cities. And in 2010, China didn't want to choose this topic. And finally, we agreed nevertheless to have it as a topic. This was only 10 years ago, and today everybody in China is not only talking about this, but addressing this, and is also working on respective technologies and opportunities. And I think it's an example where we as Europeans, if we are in the lead, if we try to return to being the lead, have excellent opportunities, business opportunities across the globe, which creates and protects jobs also back home in Europe, also in Sweden. I think we have a breakfast where we said it's food for thinking. This is something where I would like to make the connects between what is necessary, but what are the consequences, what are the positive results and opportunities. Another area which is equally important and where Europe can play a role, provided we are together ready to invest and to provide money, because it cannot be stamped by one country on its own, it's digitalization. We share the ambition to make Europe fit for the future. Sweden is ranked high in all digital fields. And you have set yourself the self-set goal to become an artificial intelligence world leader. But the EU policy supports this ambition by investing in digital infrastructure, supercomputers, artificial intelligence testing facilities. 1 krona spent on these joint facilities is hundreds of krona saved on having to do everything yourself, and at the end of the day, there are certain projects which cannot be financed by one country, neither from the financial perspective nor from, let's say, the human capacities. Here you need cooperation. Another area where cooperation is needed, of course, is migration. Sweden proved European solidarity when many refugees needed our help most in 2015. You earned a lot of respect for this all over Europe and the world. And the European Commission shares with you the opinion that we need a fair, human, and most of all, a common European migration policy. And this is why we, led by a Swedish Commissioner, Ylva Johansson, we are trying to work on a new pact on migration and asylum. Ylva Johansson is traveling around Europe, figuring out what is, so to say, really now the thinking of our member states, trying to come forward very soon with a new concept how to address this issue. But we will only be successful if we have a comprehensive approach looking at the system for asylum and return as well as external borders. Climate, artificial intelligence, migration, these are only 3 out of many examples which illustrate how we work together. Together we can find solutions. No member state could alone achieve this or even afford it, as I said previously, not only in financial terms, but also in human resource related aspects. Together, and this is also a message I would like to convey to you, we Europeans can play a role on the global stage and promote our way of life. It's time to be not only a global payer, but also a global player. And this is only possible if we, so to say, pool, if we unite our also financial efforts and means in order to achieve this goal. And this is why we are striving for, and this is why we proposed a new and modern budget which translates our common political priorities into concrete means and actions. And if I'm talking about our common political priorities, it's not something where some people in the Commission had an idea and fixed it and cast it into figures, into so to say, a budget. No, it's the result of many decisions, unanimously taken decisions by our member states, including Sweden, the European Parliament, etc. What we have done is simply to translate the political priorities expressed by many, many decisions in the past couple of years into a concrete budget. And this budget proposed by the Commission is already smaller than today's EU budget of 27. It's 1.11% versus 1.16 of European wealth in gross national income at present. But as a consequence of Brexit, national contributions are expected to go up. I mean, what we have tried was, on the one hand, to anticipate the leave of the second biggest net contributor, but on the other hand, there are some issues which are not changing as needs. Take, for instance, external border control. The most important external border we have to control is in the southern Mediterranean. And I think you need to be a great geographer to be clear that nothing will change for us, the Europeans, if the Brits are leaving or not, because the southern border stays as an external border to Europe. And to protect it means to provide the necessary financial means. And this is something which has to be understood. And I think in our proposal, we struck the right compromise between savings, but also acknowledging that there must be, so to say, a growing contribution by the individual member states in order to address the necessary needs. And I know that there's a notion in Sweden that the new budget would be unfair, that Sweden would be asked to pay too much. I actually don't agree with this. If you look at the way the current budget works, I have to say the richer the member state, the smaller a share of GNI it contributes with. So it's in a kind a reverse Robin Hood, and here I plead to the traditional strong thinking and acting of solidarity expressed by Swedish people. In a fair system, those with the broader shoulders carry a little more weight, like we do it in most welfare states in Europe where we have progressive taxes. Of course, every budget decision needs to be well thought through, especially when we want to spend more. Part of this well thought out decision is about calculating the consequences of not doing it. What would it mean if the Commission's proposal for the European Union budget is cut? With less money, what would we not be able to do? For instance, for our climate, it would mean fewer investments in sustainable projects helping to transform industry, cities and communities to become greener and more resource efficient. Would we be able to meet our ambitious targets? I fear not. And I think you have a particular sensitivity if you look at the Baltic Sea region. If we are talking about investments, if we are talking in financing transition of CO2 intensive energy production sites or CO2 intensive industrial sites, we have a lot around the Baltic Sea. Not in your country, but in other countries. You're fully aware. But if we are successful in transforming these industries, these energy operators, it has an immediate impact on the environmental situation of the Baltic Sea, and therefore you are benefiting a lot. And you would, I mean, climate doesn't know any borders, and therefore we have to look from a broader perspective on all this. So the same applies for migration policy, the same is for digital efforts. I mean, if we don't have the necessary means, we would not be able to finance the 2 planned supercomputers. Each of them worth, or the investment needed is 1 billion euro per machine. And if we are not doing so, we are not able to participate in the race on the artificial intelligence between the United States and China. So again, there are many examples, and it's important to understand we have to invest, and the European budget is in itself something unique, because I'm not aware that anywhere in the world a political entity, a bloc or a state is thinking in a 7-year period in terms of budgeting. But this 7 years budgeting enables us to provide necessary financial means for a rather predictable future, but also giving reassurance and guarantees how much money is available. This is, for instance, extremely important. I'm saying this as a former Minister for Science and Research, for the research community, to be reassured how much money is available, not thinking in annual terms, but in longer terms, 7 years terms. And of course, within this, we need to keep a certain flexibility in order to address if there are new developments, phenomena. I remember in my first period as Commissioner, the Arab Spring popped up and we had to address it. In the second period, it was the migration wave, and we managed finally to address all this by redeploying our financial means, which have been budgetized, but where we have a certain flexibility. So all in all, I think it's the way how Europe can and should react to global challenges by not only sticking together, but also understand that we have to invest in our own future in order to protect the European way of life, and not only to protect, but in a more dynamic thinking to promote this European way of life, which is finally in all our interest. Thank you very much.
Then I would ask Sven, Fredrik, and Sofia to also come up.
First, a few introductory remarks, and I think we all agree that, and that has also been mentioned by the Commission, that funding of research and innovation are investments in knowledge and knowledge-based development of our society. And I think that Europe can become, has, or at least has the potential to become world leading in this respect. But the development depends on the transfer of knowledge to decision makers, to industry, to health care sector, for instance, and also to the whole society. And I think that there is a dual responsibility for this in order to really make sure that the investments in research and innovation make a change. And scientists should engage more in outreach and be open to input from stakeholders. But also decision makers should be as Greta Thunberg says, listen to the scientists. I think this is important, and it's not just listen, it's also to take care of legislation. I think that is extremely important when it comes to gene editing, to artificial intelligence, for instance, so really to make sure that we can make use of all the knowledge that is created in this process. I think there are 2 or 3 really important requirements for the success of European research and innovation funding. There should be a European added value in this funding. And very important also is that the best researchers should be attracted by EU funding. If there is less money and if it's really complicated to apply, not the best researcher will not apply. And we really need the best researcher there to take care of all these important issues that the framework program addresses. So these are 2 really key requirements: European added value and attraction by the best researchers. And also national funding and EU research funding should be complementary. We have to think about that, the national funding and the European funding to really discuss, so that they two together becomes more than two, actually. To be a little bit more specific concerning the program, I think that there has been an improvement in all aspects. We see now the ninth framework program, Horizon Europe, and it's developing. And I think it has been an improvement really in all these respects I mentioned. So I think these requirements are indeed fulfilled. And probably the ninth framework program, Horizon Europe, is the best program of all of them. It's also the largest, and I hope it will be receive a sufficient budget really to reach the goals of the program. It's actually the largest research program in the world. So we should be proud of that and proud of European collaboration in these respects. A few remarks concerning the framework program. I think that the ERC, that funding instrument, European Research Council, is an excellent initiative in many respects. It is really a prestigious grant, and I think that fulfills the second requirement mentioned, that the best researchers are indeed attracted by this, and it gives Europe a reputation. We can see we have the best researchers in the world in Europe. And also a lot of breakthroughs have come out of ERC funding, Nobel Prizes and a lot of patents, etc. Mobility instruments are also very important, that there is a clear European added value for that, so we should really keep those. Societal challenges and industry competitiveness in the way it's presented in Horizon Europe, I think has the possibility to attract the best researchers. It also includes areas where there is a clear European added value. The concept of missions is interesting, I think. But still there is perhaps a few unclear parts of that. So exactly what it means, I think we have to see. But I think anyway, it has the potential to become a driver for research-based development. And to end a few words about research infrastructure, I think this is also extremely important for research, but it's expensive, and we have to work together in Europe, and we have a really good track record of that. There are many research infrastructures that we share in Europe, and we should certainly continue that. The Commissioner mentioned supercomputing, and that's an area where we will lag a little bit behind. China, US are really indeed stronger on that, and I like this new initiative, HPC Europe, that we're taking part of. It's very important. The funding of research infrastructure perhaps should come from national funding, but I think that European funding could add to that in terms of making more efficient use of the research infrastructure, and also to broaden the use, include industry, for instance, in the delivery components to infrastructure, and also to use at least some of them. So those were a few thoughts that I have concerning the research and innovation part, and as I said, I really think that there is a potential with sufficient funding of the coming framework program for Europe to take one step more in making use of research and innovation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you, Commissioner Hahn, for your opening speech. Well, my area is agriculture. I represent the Federation of Swedish Farmers, LRF, and we are an organization with roughly 140,000 members, with a basis in the green industries like agriculture, forestry, but also rural population. And, well, when you speak about EU budget and farmer, you come to the Common Agriculture Policy, or the CAP. And the CAP has almost since the EU was founded taken a very large part of the EU budget. This share has decreased a lot. When Sweden became a member in 1995, the CAP had almost 60% of the total EU budget. And now with your proposal, it's roughly 30%. And at the same time, you can also see figures from Eurostat showing how dependent farmers across Europe are of the CAP, and how large share of their income that comes from these payments, these income payments. And in Sweden, I would say that, well, roughly 60% of the average income from a farmer comes from these monies. So of course, these payments are extremely important. We have two parts of the payments, the ones that are very similar within the member states. The levels can be a little bit different, but the regulations, the rules, the conditions farmers have to fulfill, they are quite similar. And I would say that we have it's a very value added for farmers across Europe that we have this policy, this common policy, so that we can compete on the same basis and that we don't distort the internal market. Then we have the parts of the policy which is more defined on national level, and here we have also a large share of national co-financing. This is today called the Rural Development Program, and here we have money to realize that research you speak about, or to realize climate investments, and to work for even more sustainable agriculture, and those money are very used in Sweden, very important in Sweden. And I was a little bit surprised with the Commission's proposal that this part of the money on EU level will decrease by about 15%. That's quite a lot. And I would say, if we also talk about these income payments, the first part I spoke about, and the importance of these payments, I think it's vital for the whole of Europe, and not least Sweden, that we have a thriving agriculture. In Sweden, we import about 50% of everything we eat. And then I don't speak about coffee and bananas. I speak about meat and milk and other things that we could produce in Sweden. And if we don't produce them in Sweden, or of course in Europe, then we will import from countries maybe with lower standards. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have trade. We should absolutely have trade, but we should be aware of the importance of taking care of our own production. Yeah, and I would say, well, a lot of is about climate today, and in the discussion here today, and also in society as a whole. And climate, farmers are both affected by the climate, by drought and maybe excess of water some years, but they are also part of the solution. So I would say that the CAP, the Common Agriculture Policy, is very important for the solution for a sustainable future. Thank you.
The Green Deal gives me a lot of hope, and that's of course an important part of the budget. And we need to really, on a massive scale up the investments to climate action. We need to cut emissions by half in the coming 10 years. And in that sense, the EU budget, a 7-year budget, represents a unique window of opportunity to address climate action, of course, if we focus it in the right direction. And what's the right direction? First of all, we from the EPA would say that that we need to focus the budget on where it can really, as you said, make added value, address our shared, common, largest climate and environmental challenges. For example, the industrial transformation, seeing to that we together as countries in Europe find, scale up and deploy the technology shifts needed to transform industry in Europe and to come out as strong competitors on a global market with the best climate-friendly products. Secondly, turning around emissions in transport, hugely important. And thirdly, once we have gone down to zero, to try to find ways to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And that's something we probably have to prepare ourselves for already now. And of course, agriculture is one important pillar there. So focusing on the main biggest challenges. Secondly, my second point is that the MFF is a unique window of opportunity, but it will never be big enough to do the job alone, no matter the size. Public money, of course, is tremendously important to reduce risks for private capital and for some investments, but we need to get all the capital flows in the right direction. And for us, in the field of climate and environment, we see it as very important for this Commission to present an ambitious and comprehensive package on rules and regulations on the environment and particularly the climate. The current legislation we have is based on a pre-Paris ambition. Now we need a comprehensive, ambitious package for the post-Paris time. And such a package, if we could agree on it, would certainly help directing private capital flows in the right direction. And maybe that's one of the best effects the MFF could have, to make it possible for us as member states to agree on such a legislative package. So I hope that's something the MFF can contribute to. My third and last point is that it's a good ambition that we now increase the spending on climate action through the budget. The goal is at least 25%. Good. But it's equally important that the rest, the 75%, isn't harmful for the environment. And looking at the past, we have certainly seen some environmentally harmful spending from the budget. That's true. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. Applause for you as well. Time is running too quickly. There's a lot to say, but Commission would like to comment on this, and then we open up the floor for questions.
Yeah, only briefly. I think one thing I want to recall is I think we shouldn't create, and there is, in my understanding, not a contradiction between what they call traditional policy and, so to say, the new or the current challenges, also expressed in so to say, budgetary numbers. And this means the agricultural policy has and should contribute at least 40% to our climate goals. Cohesion should also contribute to at least 30% of their budget to climate goals. For instance, if we invest in the further extension of our railway network across Europe, we might be able to offer much more attractive connections instead of short distance flights, which are very CO2 emission. So I think there are many elements which fit together, and we should not play one policy against the other. So for instance, we have provided a significant amount of money within the future research program dedicated to research and innovation activities in the area of agriculture, also contributing exactly to those goals. So it's the overall package, and may I say the 25% is ambitious, but it's the beginning, and everything has to be seen, as it was rightly said. Europe can only so to say, initiate things. And of course, it's a lot of money, but it's nevertheless only for seed financing. Others have to come in. And with some regulatory support, we might also trigger a lot of private investments. We received a lot of calls from investment companies, from investors, asking us almost urgently to come forward what we call taxonomy, which means to define which kind of investment is, so to say, related to the Green Deal, to the improvement of the climate situation. And there is a growing demand, not only in Europe, but across the world, to invest in such areas. And if we as Europeans define what are the areas, this is another contribution in terms of substance, but also in terms of concrete figures in the improvement of climate goals, not only in Europe, but so to say on a global scale. So what I want to say is many things fitting together have to be seen in a more comprehensive way, and then we are able to succeed. And I'm always saying we have to provide climate cash in order to avoid a climate crash.
Thank you. So now we can open up for questions, and we have Isaac has a microphone there. So.
Thank you. Manfred Schüler, German Embassy here in Stockholm. I have a question for the Commissioner. Apart from the climate crisis, also we have other crises in the world, and Ms. von der Leyen spoke about hard power, more assertive Europe in Davos. Could you elaborate a little bit what does this mean for the budget? How does this reflect in the next 7 years?
Thank you. She will take the second question also, and then we can answer them both, please.
Okay, Christer Berinder. I have a question to the Commissioner in the first place. Does EU have any plans to ease up the European market for agricultural products in relation to the rest of the world? Restrictions?
Up, you mean open up?
Open up
for
the
imports.
European agricultural market, food products and so on. Are there any plans to open EU to the rest of the world?
For more imports?
For more imports.
Okay.
In terms of duties, customs, and restrictions, regulations.
Thank you very much. Shall we start with these two questions? I think they were for the Commissioner both.
Briefly on the first, indeed, already in the draft budget proposal of 2018, we have foreseen an increase for foreign policy, for the foreign policy budget of around 22%. But I have to say the current budget for foreign policy is less than, the share is less than 10%. So it's not that much, but the main goals are, so to say, Western Balkan, second, neighborhood, and third, Africa. And this again fits into our overall, so to say, aim to improve living conditions of people, and therefore contributing again, so to say, to the issues of climate change, because if we want to address the root causes of migration, we have to invest in the holistic, may I say so, development, for instance, of African countries, to invest in the industry, in the diversification of the industry, agriculture, but equally important, education, institutional developments, etc. So I think it's clear where our targets are, and this is again Western Balkan, important to, so to say, increase the welfare level in our own courtyard, if you like, inner courtyard. Second, the neighborhood. It's like always, either we export stability or we would import instability. And that's why it is so important to invest, so to say, in the further development of our own neighborhood. On the other hand, second question, I think you refer to international trade agreements. I think we are living in a phase where multilateralism is under threat, meaning a world where the coexistence of states, of people, is based on agreements, on state treaties, on contractual agreements. And this is something we have to preserve. We, the Europeans, are the most depending on such a multilateral legal structure, because Europe is the most exposed continent to international relations. We are the continent which is exporting the most in relation to what we are producing, but we are also receiving, so to say, the highest number of imports. And the same applies for financial direct investments outside Europe, but also inside Europe. So therefore, we have to have every interest. We are not a military power. We are an economic power. We are the biggest, the most attractive market in the world. And so we should have an interest to further strengthen the legal, the contractual arrangement. And may I say, if we are doing this now, we have a much better negotiation position than we will have in 10 years or in 20 years. 10, 15 years ago, Europe and the US counted for 2/3 of the global trade. Today, we are only, so to say, our share is only 50%. And in another 10, 15 years, the share of Europe and the US on the overall global trade would be only 1/3 of the world trade. Not because we are, so to say, becoming weaker in terms of our output, but simply the other ones, the emerging countries, are catching up, and therefore our share goes down. And this also means our political leverage is declining. And therefore, whatever we can negotiate, agree now, is much more, so to say, in our interest. Our leverage now is today much higher than it will be in the future. And we have clearly stated, and that's my final sentence in that respect, in each future trade agreement, we will integrate the Paris climate goals as a condition to strike an agreement. And this we can only achieve now, and I am sure that our political power, our political leverage in 10, 15 years is not that much as it is today. That's why I can only, so to say, urge and support any kind of deal we can strike today, because be reassured, if we negotiate on behalf of 500 million people for the most attractive market in the world, our position at the negotiation table is much better than the position of the other side, because the other side always wants to have access to the European market, and this should and has to have its price.
Thank you. Sofia, would you like to comment on the agricultural products as well?
Well, I think the Commissioner answered this question in a very good way. So,
no more comment? No?
Well, I could comment that there has been quite a few trade agreements during the last Commission, and a lot is doing concerning trade. It's not my area of expertise, so I'd rather...
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Rolf Hoyer. I have two short questions. One, Mrs. von der Leyen has identified the need to cut red tape and reduce regulatory burden. Therefore, she has proposed the principle of one in, one out. So I would like to ask you, how do you employ this in the development of the MFF? Secondly, there's been quite a lot of talk about conditionality, making payments from the European programs conditional on democracy and rule of law requirements. I think many people have some specific nations in mind when they talk about this, but of course such a rule would have to be applied equitably. In fact, there is some legislation in Sweden which has been deemed, should we say, unconstitutional by the Swedish Council of Legislation. Do you perceive any situation where funds might actually be withheld from Sweden for such a reason?
Thank you. My name is Lena Johansson. I have a background in EU budget, agriculture, and trade. My question is on the financing of the budget. The discussion is not only about the size of the budget and the members' contribution, but also about the EU's own resources. Can you tell us a few words about the new ideas of new sources of own resources?
Thank you.
I think honestly, we have already shown that we are ready to reduce red tape. I think I'm not aware that any of our member states has really deleted. We have deleted almost 1,000 regulations and directives in the past couple of years. Not replaced by new ones, but really there are less regulations. So unfortunately, we have, for whatever reasons, still the image to be a bureaucratic monster, but the reality shows and proves something different. And I have always proposed the introduction, for instance, of a so-called sunset clause in legislation, meaning that each law should have a date where it expires. And this means that at a certain moment, one has to look into this law if it should be extended, if it should be modified, or if it might also be deleted, if there is no need to regulate something. And this would mean that the lawmakers are not forced to produce new laws, but they can also, so to say, direct their energy into the, so to say, assessment of the current regulation, which has always to be modified. And it's also important that our member states are not adding a gold plating at European regulations in order to introduce further provisions for the use, for instance, of structural fund money in a country, which is very often the case, and which is really, so to say, increasing the level of administration and bureaucracy. Rule of law is a big issue. We will push hard that rule of law as an element is also introduced into the next multi-annual financial framework. About the concrete example you have mentioned, I can't say anything. What I can say is that we have adopted already in summer last year a decision in the European Commission that as of this year we will have a rule of law scoreboard analysis in order to see across Europe in all member states what's about certain developments in the area of rule of law, in order to treat all our member states equally and not to provoke that some people might think, or some countries, they are the target of particular, so to say, actions. There might be in all our countries there and there deficiencies. And I think nobody can guarantee that there are not deficiencies in a country. And we have to see it on a, so to say, comprehensive view, and to address this and to analyze this and to try to improve the situation where needed. On resources, sorry. On resources, you know, already 1957, the year of my birth, and I will in a couple of years retire, there was a first decision about own resources for the European Union, at that time European Common Market, and this decision of 57 was confirmed in 1970, also almost 50 years ago. Since then, nobody reconfirmed it because, so to say, the appetite to really introduce new own resources is not that much. But I have to say, in the meantime, the European Commission, but may I also say the European Parliament, is very eager to introduce own resources as part of the revenue side of the European budget. We are not talking to replace the national contributions. I think this is unrealistic. But there are many good reasons to introduce own resources, but because own resources are also contributing to steer consumer behavior or to compensate competition distortions. I give you two examples. The one very concrete potential new own resource could be a plastic levy, plastic waste levy for those plastic which is not recycled. And I think this is in finally all our interest, and it might end up that in some years we don't have any revenue from that, but this is, so to say, what we are aiming at, to reduce the use of plastic and in particular the non-recycled plastic. Another issue is the border carbon tax, where we are discussing the introduction of, let's say, a contribution. However, it's finally legally constructed because there are also some constraints. But if a product is outside Europe produced in a very CO2 intensive way, and we are trying by introducing new technologies to reduce the CO2 emission for the same product, it might lead to a distortion in terms of competitiveness. And this has to be compensated. And I think it's only fair to do so and to think about such measures. And these are only two examples, and there are many others. But important is that we get a fundamental, legally binding decision that own resources can be introduced, provided finally member states and the parliament agree about it.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you very much to the panel for participating, and thank you very much to the audience. Thank you.